Against the backdrop of the ongoing war between the US and Iran, a major scandal has erupted. The Associated Press published an investigation based on hundreds of emails from employees of the US Immigration Service. They show that in 2025 and 2026, ICE coordinated with Iranian authorities to deport Iranian citizens, even when tensions between the two countries peaked during the war. In fact, the US handed over to the regime in Tehran Iranians who might have been fleeing from that very regime. And just a few months before that, Donald Trump himself, let me remind you, in an address to the Iranian people said, quote, "The hour of your freedom has come," and immediately called for protests against the regime. And so it turns out that while the US president publicly called on Iranians to take power into their own hands, his own immigration agency was quietly sending them back from the US into the hands of that very same regime. Moreover, in these correspondences between US immigration officials, facts emerged that are simply hard to keep silent about. For example, the Americans were handing over all the information about those Iranians who were in their country, including the fact that they were seeking asylum and that they had complained about being persecuted by the regime. As you can imagine, unfortunately, there can be no talk of safety for such Iranians upon their return to Tehran. So let's break down this story in detail and lay everything out clearly. My name is Alexei Piechi. Before we begin, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to this channel. And if you want to support the work of an independent YouTube channel, you can do so with any donation using the links and details in the description of this video. So, in the United States of America, a major scandal is erupting against the backdrop of the war in the Middle East. The National Iranian American Council has published hundreds of letters from employees of the US Immigration Service, ICE, which for the first time show in detail how the United States of America and Iran organized free flights that were used to return more than 100 people to Iran in September and December 2025 and in January 2020. According to the Associated Press, this correspondence provides, quote, "the most detailed step-by-step picture to date of how the two countries cooperated in organizing deportation flights." The letters show that Iranian authorities openly influenced exactly which immigrants would be included on the deportation lists. And ICE employees took Tehran's requests into account, even at the last moment. At the request of the Iranian embassy, I added several cases. One of the unnamed employees of the US Immigration Service wrote this at the end of August 2025, even before the first flight in September. A week later, an employee with the same position made new changes to the list after meeting with the director of the Iranian embassy. And later he wrote that Iran demanded, quote, "to change the manifest and speed up the deportation process." And the US sped up this process. The detail about the logistics of the flights themselves is also telling. The final manifest of those being deported was sent to Qatar's Ministry of Interior. So in other words, Doha acted as a technical intermediary in organizing the flights themselves between countries that do not have direct diplomatic relations. There was also an obvious mishap, which shows just how poorly, chaotically and opaquely all of this worked. Correspondence between ICE employees shows that at least one person, who was not even on the final list, still ended up on the deportation flight. An Iranian who was not included in the final manifest that we sent to the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Qatar ended up on the flight, wrote one of the unnamed officials. Another replied, quote, "I have no idea how this case or this person ended up on the plane at all." So even ICE officials themselves couldn't explain how the person ended up on the deportation flight to Iran, bypassing their own official list. Just imagine the chaos that was happening there and how many people could have been deported illegally. The timing of everything that happened is especially telling. The coordination of the deportation remained a priority, even, mind you, against the backdrop of the 12-day war between the US, Israel and Iran. In June 2025, when Iranians were leaving the country en masse, the Iranian authorities temporarily stopped issuing travel documents for those being deported. Judging by the correspondence, the pressure to speed up the process was coming from the very top of the White House. Acting ICE Director Todd Lyons called the repatriation of Iranians a priority. Just a few days after President Donald Trump himself called on social media for the immediate evacuation of Tehran as he was preparing strikes. Think about it. In other words, Trump is saying, "People, leave Tehran because we are going to bomb this area." And at this time, Todd Lyons says, "Oh, so we're about to bomb? Let's get as many Iranians as possible who are up for deportation out there as quickly as possible so we can close this chapter." And here it's worth remembering what Donald Trump was publicly saying during those same weeks. In his address to the Iranian people on February 28, he said, "When we are done, take power into your own hands. It will be yours. This is probably your only chance for many generations. The hour of your freedom has come. For many years you asked America for help, but you never received it. No president has ever been willing to do what I am ready to do tonight. Now you have a president who gives you what you want. Let's see how you respond." Earlier, Trump also said that the goal of the war is freedom for the Iranian people. So at the same time as this public rhetoric about protecting Iranians from a repressive regime, his own department was coordinating with that same regime to send people back. The president of the National Iranian American Council, Jamal Abdi, stated, quote, "The correspondence refutes Trump's claim that the war with Iran was waged to protect ordinary Iranians from repression. This shows that the main priority was to deport as many people as possible by any means." But in fact, there is a second, even more troubling angle to this story. This is a separate lawsuit filed in July in the District Court in Washington. 11 detained Iranians in immigration detention testified under oath that they were forced to meet with representatives of the Iranian government right in ICE detention facilities. Moreover, Iranian officials were aware of rather intimate details of their asylum cases. The lawsuit claims that US immigration agencies illegally shared confidential information about asylum seekers in the US with Iran. However, these very Iranians were actually seeking asylum in the US from that same Iranian government, meaning they were fleeing from it. They were fleeing, seeking asylum, and even if the US doesn't grant them asylum, the US cannot tell Iran, "Look, they wanted to escape from you, they asked us for asylum, and now we're handing them over to you." Here, let's say an important legal detail matters, so let's make a note of it. The US government is formally allowed to cooperate with any foreign authorities to coordinate deportation logistics. There's nothing unusual here. It's logical that if the US wants to deport someone, the receiving side should at least be aware of it. No issues, everything is fine. But federal regulations adopted back in the late 1990s directly prohibit disclosure. Information that could reveal that a deported person applied for asylum. It was exactly this prohibition that, according to the plaintiffs, was violated. The US Department of Homeland Security categorically rejected these accusations in July and stated, quote, "The claim that ICE transmitted records of asylum applications to the Iranian government is false." At the same time, an earlier investigation by the New York Times had already shown that among those deported to Iran were in fact asylum seekers. And some people stated that they were deported against their will. In other words, the recent correspondence from ICE doesn't create this picture from scratch. It's not something new. It confirms and details what had already been reported earlier. And here it's also important to keep in mind what a person actually faces if they're deported back to Iran after having applied for asylum in another country. According to the data reported by Western media during the same period, During the suppression of nationwide protests on January 8 and 9, security forces loyal to the Islamic regime in Iran killed. Officially, more than 36,500 people were killed in just 2 days. Trump himself commented at the time that the security forces were literally really shooting demonstrators with machine guns in the streets, which made it almost impossible for unarmed civilians to resist the authorities in any way. So, against the backdrop of the already documented willingness of the regime to kill its own citizens by the thousands just for protesting, the deportation of asylum seekers back into the hands of that same apparatus is not just some bureaucratic mishap. No, it's a decision with potentially deadly consequences for specific individuals. In conclusion, publicly, Donald Trump called the war with Iran a war for the freedom of the Iranian people, personally urged Iranians to take power into their own hands, and promised American support in their hour of freedom. At the same time, his own immigration service was quietly negotiating with the embassy of that very regime, coordinating lists of deportees at Tehran's request. And if we are to believe the sworn testimonies of 11 detained Iranians, it allowed Iranian officials to forcibly meet with asylum seekers in person, right in ICE detention centers, knowing quite intimate details of their cases. Can the US deport illegal immigrants? Yes, of course they can, if there are grounds for it. No one is arguing with US laws here at all. But to reveal to the regime in Iran that the deportee had requested protection and asylum because he was afraid of that very regime is to put a person in danger upon their return to their homeland. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell and don't forget to like. That's all for now, take care of yourselves, goodbye everyone.